Nature has an order, a power to restore balance. I believe he is that power. We call him Godzilla.
Now, part of the initial problem with the human cast relative to that problem I just mentioned earlier of the movie not being enough about the people's reaction to these giant monsters is the people that the movie decides to focus on as its human cast. Unfortunately, the movie picks a roster of characters who are trained to push their emotions aside and just deal with the situation as it stands, not lending to a movie that's actually about the people's reactions to the giant monsters, which is a really big problem since that's what a lot of people wanted to see from it, and I think that would have made for a more interesting movie. But that being said, let's get specifically into the human cast. First and foremost, the one that is one of the biggest proponents of this problem I just brought up, let's talk about Ford Brody. Ford Brody is one of the most controversial film protagonists I have seen in a very long time. A lot of people don't like the dude. Both the character and Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance as him have been criticized heavily by everybody, calling him boring, flat, lackluster, and outacted by every single other character in the movie. Now, I don't agree with this 100%. I think Aaron Taylor Johnson does fine given the material that he's given, and as most people have said, he's doing a pretty good job at characterizing a soldier, at least the ones I've met. He holds himself up straight, he has a very kind of humble, good-natured attitude about everything. You know, of course, he's got the things that piss him off, his relationship with his father being one of them. But overall, he's a pretty even-keeled type of character. And that's really good for a soldier. So you really can't give Aaron Taylor Johnson a lot of crap for that performance, since it's accurate to who he's playing. Most of the problems lie with the script itself, and overall by the virtue of focusing on a soldier. Now, interestingly, this is really the first Godzilla movie to feature a traditional soldier as the lead protagonist. Now, I know that sounds really bizarre given the franchise's tropes and history, but thinking back on the franchise's history, this is the first time we've got a traditional soldier in the driving seat of the film. Other Godzilla movies have featured military-type people as their protagonists, mainly pilots, but those have always been of giant mechs and not traditional on-the-ground soldiers. You know, Aoki in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 is the protagonist, but he's not a soldier, he's a robotics engineer who got roped into being a soldier because of shitty G-force politics. And that's probably the closest the franchise ever really got to having a traditional soldier as the protagonist. Actually, the biggest trope in Godzilla movie history in regards to its main human protagonist is the character being a reporter. It's a huge, huge cliche for the series to do that, and more than half of them actually have reporters in as either the lead protagonist, like Maki in Godzilla 1985, or more classically, Sakai in Mothra vs. Godzilla. So, strangely enough, this is the first time to have a soldier as the lead protagonist. Now, again, seems like kind of an obvious thing to do, given the military being one of the forces that's going to interact the most with the monsters that the movie is also about. But I think this movie also demonstrates why doing that can be kind of a shot in the foot, and why none of the other Godzilla movies ever really did it. And the reason is because soldiers are trained to suppress their emotions when they're dealing with tense situations, mainly when they're going to battle trying to save the world or their country or however you want to describe it. They're trained to suppress their emotions, put their feelings aside, and focus on the mission. So the reason why I think Ford is kind of flat in terms of his personality in regards to his emotional response to the situations in the film is, again, that he's a seasoned soldier who has been trained to do that. Especially since not only is he just a grunt, he's also a goddamn explosive ordnance disposal soldier. He's not just a typical guy on the ground with a gun. The dude takes apart live bombs for a living. So he, more than any other soldier, is going to be trained to keep his emotions back, handle stress, and focus on the situation at hand. So again, I think Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance is great in terms of capturing that and showing that, but the character himself, in terms of being written, is kind of a strange choice for an emotional lead because he's trained to suppress those emotions. So I don't so much think it's the fact that the character is bad and that the performance is bad. I just think that it was a strange choice in terms of putting the film together. Now, as a protagonist, I actually think he's pretty good. He does get some emotional weight in a couple of regards, but he's a good POV type of character. We get to learn a lot about realistically learn a lot about the universe and about the story through him without a lot of kind of clunky shift in perspective, which is something that a lot of monster movies really attempt, is to give us one solid character to bunker down and get to know that we can then experience the craziness with. And Ford is a good character for that, and he achieves that purpose quite well, kind of bouncing all over the world as the monster situation is going on. Now, at points it gets a little bit ridiculous that the monsters are showing up where he happens to be, the most ridiculous of them being when he's in Honolulu going home, and the male Muto just happens to show up at that airport, and that's where Godzilla happens to have his first fight with the male Muto. It's really, really convenient. But all in all, good choice for a POV character that we're going to follow and learn about the story with. One of the other things that I really like about Ford is his relationship to the theme and to the story. It's one of the best things about the movie, and it's probably the best thing about Ford's character. I really like him becoming an EOD, because it's really subtle and also really, really cool given the dude's backstory. Think about it. As a kid, his mother was killed in what he perceived as a nuclear meltdown. An earthquake causing an atomic reactor to go haywire and kill everybody in the building except for his father. It makes perfect sense for him to become an EOD. He wants to prevent that from happening to anybody else, and it might even give him a sense of control over his life that he didn't have when he was a kid. Being able to disarm those situations and prevent his life from being ruined. Again, there's a great little moment in the beginning of the movie, right before Ford goes to Japan to bail his dad out of jail, when he's talking to Elle, and Elle reminds him that he should be a little bit more lenient on his father because he lost everything in the Janjira meltdown. But Ford reminds her, yeah, so did I, and I got over it. Now, she also says that he really didn't, given his current emotional reaction. But what Ford reminds us is that that incident still weighs heavily on his mind, and I think that him becoming an EOD was his own personal way of gaining control over it, and it feels like a natural progression of the story and of the characters, rather than kind of just a kitschy way to get a protagonist in the film that is both connected to this conspiracy and also connected to the military, so he'll be able to be involved in all the military operations against the monsters later on. It's a good, natural, interesting way to achieve all of that, and a really well-made decision and well-executed decision. Now, in regards to his relations to the theme of the film being that man has to stop fucking ourselves up by progressing our own destruction and just learn to fix our mistakes rather than covering them up and repeating them over and over again, which is not only the theme of the film, but also the theme of the entire goddamn franchise. I really like Ford's place in that, and it's one of the best aspects of the story as well, in regards to connecting the human story to the monster story. So, the personal story of Ford and his family is really well tied into the overarching theme that I just mentioned. Because Ford's whole character arc in the movie is learning from his father that you can't just bury everything in the past, forget about it, and move on. You've got to face the past and proactively try and fix it, rather than just continuously running away from it and trying to forget about it, which is what that whole scene in Joe Brody's house is about right before they go back to Janjira. Now, Ford's arc is cemented when he decides to finally give in to his father's request and go back with him to Janjira to try and figure out what was going on and warn the world that something really bad is about to go down there. And Ford going back to his own house is the embodiment of him facing his past and learning to come to grips with it. I love that moment where he picks up that little toy soldier and he carries it with him all the way to Hawaii. It's almost kind of like that's the thing that inspired him to be a soldier, and that it's now his connection to his past. Now, the other aspect that goes into this, aside from Ford fitting nicely into the theme of the story, is also that he also gets to learn something from his father that his father also learns, which I'll talk about in a minute when I get to Joe Brody, is that you can't take your family for granted. You have to spend every possible moment with them that you can, and you always have to put their safety above everything else. They are the most important thing in your world, which is something that both Ford and Joe kind of have in common, is that they both push their families aside a little bit for their jobs. Joe, in the prologue in 1999, Joe kind of ignores his son because he's on the phone with the power plant where he works, trying to warn them about this whole thing going on. Then Joe loses part of his family with Sandra dying, and later on he realizes that he should have spent as much time with them as possible and focused on keeping them safe rather than chasing after his own career and after anything else. They're the most important thing in a man's life. And Ford's in a little bit of a similar situation, being in the Navy and being away for years at a time, going off into war and being stationed in places all over the world. Both men are pushing their families aside for seemingly good reasons, Joe trying to stop a nuclear meltdown, and Ford going off to protect his country, but at the same time, they're ignoring their families. And they both kind of learn that you have to put your family above everything else. Otherwise, you're going to lead to a regretful life where you didn't get to spend as much time with them as you could, and then you lose them. Kind of lends perspective in a way, and that's the thing that Ford takes away from his father, spending the rest of the movie trying to get back to his family. Which makes that moment at the end where all three of the Brody clan are reunited really, really touching. And a good way to cap off Ford's story. Now, while I like all of this, the problem is a couple different things. So, Ford's story kind of ends a little bit prematurely, at least in regards to his character development and his relation to the theme of the story. It still continues a little bit, but the point where it kind of dies is kind of the point where most of the interesting things about the story die, and that's after Joe Brody dies and after everything at Janjira is done. Once Joe dies, Ford's story with his father and Ford's character development of learning to face the past is completely over, and it becomes something else entirely about him trying to get back to his family and stop all this stuff with the monsters going on. Now again, it makes sense given the stuff that he learned from Joe. But the stuff that he was learning from his father completely stops halfway through the movie, and it feels like the rest of the movie is just more stuff with this character, and it feels like all the interesting stuff about him has been left behind, which is something that the movie loses a lot of. Now, I'm not really sure how you could fix this, except in the obvious way of not making Joe Brody die at Janjira, but we'll talk about that in a second. But I wish there would have been a way to prolong his character arc throughout the entire movie. Again, his story continues. His trying to get back to his family and protect them, which is what was his father's last words to his son. Keep them safe, whatever it takes. It just feels over a little bit too soon, and that the rest of the movie is just kind of the finality of his character arc just spread out over an hour. It's a little bit weird and a little bit poorly constructed. But again, I'm not really sure how you fix it given the movie that we have. The other thing in regards to this is that the dude just gets a little bit too much focus in regards to the wider story, regardless of how much I like what they do with him. we just cut back to him and what he's going through too much and too often. Again, I like the guy, but there's also a whole other spectrum of stuff going on around him. There's Godzilla's story, the Muto story, the military story, Serizawa's story, all this different stuff, and we keep cutting back to him and him trying to get back to his family. At a certain point, it becomes a little bit redundant. He gets somewhere, the monsters stop him from getting to his family, and then he has to go somewhere else and do something else. It gets a little bit repetitive, and there's so much more interesting stuff going on around him that I wish we could jump away from him for a little bit and go experience something else. Again, I know the monster movie is trying, that monster movies should try and have that anchor point to kind of sit in the driver's seat with and experience everything through their eyes, but at a certain point, it doesn't. Ford stops giving any real interesting things in regards to the story and the perspective that he's seeing, and it becomes a little bit repeating everything that we've seen and done before this. So I wish they would have found a way to kind of move away from him, or find ways to kind of take him into different places, so that way we can see a little bit more of what's going on, and that it's not just him in the same situation over and over again. So he's a little bit too simplistic to get about as much focus as he does, which kind of sucks. But overall, I like Ford, and I think that he gets a little bit too much hate in regards to both Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance, his character arc, and his place in the theme. But I do agree that he has way too much screen time, and that the movie should have been written differently to make him a little bit more of a match for the emotional reaction to the monsters that the movie should have been about. So I agree with that completely, but I still like the guy. Now, I also want to briefly mention Ford's family, mainly Elle and his son Sam, because the movie kind of becomes about them a little bit indirectly, where they're not the primary focus in regards to their perspectives, though they both get scenes of being the primary focus. But the ultimate goal of Ford's story is to get back to them. Now, I like Elle and Sam. There's a good scene at the beginning where Ford comes home and spends that time with his family, and we get to see that they've got a good family dynamic. He and Elle, Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Elizabeth Olsen have a good husband-wife kind of dynamic, which is completely awkward given the roles that they're both going to have in the next Avengers movie. But for this movie, it works really well. And I like them as a couple, and you do definitely get invested in the story of Ford getting to see her again. So they're likable enough, but the problem is, again, that they're just too focused on in regards to the goals of the story. It just feels very, very small and kind of boring for them to be so important to the overall goals of the film that we're kind of losing a lot of the other really interesting stuff going on. It's kind of the same thing I had with Ford, where he's good, but there's so much other more interesting stuff going on around him that you kind of resent them a little bit because of how much focus they get. The other thing is, the other reason why you don't really like how much focus they get is that they don't really do anything for the story itself, except for give Ford something to go back to. And also, every now and then, to get a little bit more of the perspective of what's going on with the monsters. We cut to Elle Brody when the male Muto first lands in San Francisco, and when Godzilla first gets in San Francisco and has his fight with the male Muto. And of course, there's also the scene on the Golden Gate Bridge, where Sam Brody is on a bus going to an evac point, and Godzilla attacks the Golden Gate Bridge. But just to cap off on them, they get too much focus in the story, to be as kind of boring as they are. They don't really get any specific characterization like Ford does. Elle is just kind of a wife and a nurse, and Sam is just kind of a little kid. We don't get enough specifically about them to make us truly care about them, except for their relationship to Ford. So they should have been a little bit more well developed, given how much of the story is about them. And they don't get a ton of screen time, but they do get enough where they're a little bit too boring for that. I almost wish that, to give her more of a place in the story, they would have made Elle a reporter, because that would have given us another perspective in order to find out more about what's going on with the monsters. Because then we wouldn't have this problem with Ford of not having enough of an emotional response to the monsters, because maybe we could have gotten it through Elle, her running around San Francisco interviewing people, trying to figure out what's going on. That would have also given her a little bit better of a reason to stay in the city. I know she's being noble by staying at her nursing post to help people who are caught in the monster attack, but it would have been better for learning about the overall situation if she would have been a reporter finding out what was going on. I know that's me rewriting the movie, and that's not really fair. And it also would have kind of gone back to that trope of Godzilla movies focusing on reporters, but I think it would have been better than the situation that we're left with. But what we're left with is still fine, just a little bit too typical and a little bit underdeveloped. But getting into characters who aren't underdeveloped, let's talk about Joe Brody, another one of the most controversial characters in recent film history. Joe Brody, of course, played by Bryan Cranston, is one of the best things about the movie, bar none. And almost anybody who you ask about the film will say that Joe Brody is the best part of the movie. He is the best developed character. Bryan Cranston is amazing as always, and I'm super pissed that he died. Fuck this movie. It's shit. That's what most people will tell you. I agree with about 75% of that. Bryan Cranston is brilliant, of course. He always is. He's a master actor. He's kind of got the world as his oyster lately in regard to everybody loving him because, of course, he was Walter White on Breaking Bad. He was Hal on Malcolm in the Middle. He was the voice of several monsters on Power Rangers, but I don't think that's the reason why he's become such a master, such a well-loved actor. But anyway, I also agree that Joe Brody is the most well-rounded, well-developed, and best performed of all the characters in the movie. Losing Sandra is a really powerful scene, and a scene that I swear to God, every time I see it, makes me tear up. Regardless of how many times I see the movie and that I know it's coming. Every time I watch Joe standing at that door as the radiation comes careening towards him, and that scene where he looks at his wife in the window as the doors close, it gets me going every time. Hell, it made Quentin Tarantino cry, so if I want to cry, I'll cry, damn it. And we really come to feel for Joe, and the kind of the guilt and the self-pity that he inflicts upon himself because of how he lost his wife. One of the biggest things about his character is that Joe completely blames himself for everything that happened to Sandra, and a lot of what happened with Ford in regards to their poor relationship. In the prologue, after he ignores his son while he's on the phone with the Janjira Power Company, Sandra is trying to have a little bit of a personal conversation with him about his birthday, but Joe is very quickly to push the problem of what's going on with the reactor, and immediately says, don't even come up to the crow's nest, just go right down to the reactor and see what's going on. Joe sent her down there, and because of that decision, she's dead. And Joe completely blames himself for that. And it's part of the reason why he spends so much time and energy trying to figure out what happened, because he blames himself. He's trying to find redemption for what he did, for sending his wife down there, for, in his eyes, basically killing his wife. And it really gives him this very tragic, very human, very relatable personality, and also his story. We really come to love Joe, and we come to love following Joe, kind of as Ford being our avatar for that, following Joe around and seeing how he connects back to all the monster stuff. The other thing is that Joe, probably only second to Dr. Serizawa, is the biggest character in the movie pushing the main message of the whole Godzilla franchise and the overarching theme of the film. Again, it goes back to what I said with Ford, the whole whatever it takes thing. In that scene in his house before he and Ford go back to Janjira to figure out what's going on, he says that he's going to find out what happened and end this thing, whatever it takes. Now, Joe's whole story is about two things, and they're both kind of related to what I already said with Ford, so I'll be about as brief as I can. Joe's story is about both teaching his son to not make the same mistakes that he did, mainly taking his family for granted for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but the other thing, in kind of a weird, indirect way, teaching the rest of the world to do the same, to face the mistakes that you made in the past and fix them. You can't just cover up what happened in the past, run away and try and move on, because you are doomed to make the same mistakes in the future. That's why he is so devout on figuring out what happened at Janjira, never giving up, no matter how much pain it causes him, no matter how worse it makes the relationship with his son, and no matter how many times he gets thrown in jail. He's never going to give up. He will always try and figure out what happened, find the truth, and fix it. Because just covering it up and just running away and trying to move on and pretend like nothing weird ever happened, again, it's going to continue to happen. That is the point of Godzilla. Godzilla is nature's representation of the mistakes that man made in both World War II and the Cold War. Godzilla will never truly die because nature keeps throwing him up saying, hey guys, stop fucking around with nuclear weapons because you're only going to destroy yourselves. And that's basically the point of Joe's story. Not necessarily the point of not fucking around with nukes, but of stopping consistently making the same mistakes that you made in the past over and over again, and doing whatever you have to do to fix those mistakes. I really love Joe's story in that way, and Bryan Cranston hammers all of these points home with his incredibly emotive, varied performance that can go from being funny to heartfelt to emotional, all these points. The dude just never ceases to amaze me at just how fucking good he is. He's always so good at being an everyman to me. That's how Walter White is portrayed in Breaking Bad, why he's such a great character. And a lot of that kind of translates into Joe Brody. And not that I'm saying that Joe Brody is a ripoff of Walter White and that Bryan Cranston was just putting this movie as a marketing thing to get Breaking Bad fans to go see this movie. Though I think there was a little bit of that going on with that second trailer, but I'm not going to hammer that point home because I don't really agree with it. But no matter what the reason was, marketing or otherwise, it really helps the movie and really enhances that first half and makes it as good as it is. Again, I've said that that's the best part of the movie is from a story perspective, and I think he's a lot of the reason why. He's just so great to follow. Now, the other thing is that, and the reason why this movie is so controversial in regards to having been kind of advertised to people who love Bryan Cranston, is that he dies very, very early on and doesn't get a lot of screen time. So strangely enough, the two big things that everybody wanted to see from the movie, Bryan Cranston and Godzilla, are probably the two least things that it gives you, which is kind of funny. But anyway, so there's a lot to say in regards to Joe Brody's death. There's a lot of good, a lot of bad. Good. His death is really, really powerful, and you know, a lot of that is that you know, we kind of feel it with Ford that we're losing this guy that we've been getting to know for the past part of this movie, and also Ford is losing his father, and we've also come to like Ford. So his death definitely feels very, very emotional. The problem is that it also feels a little bit forced, because the reasons that he is killed off so early, as said by Gareth Edwards, is that they couldn't really figure out anything to do with him past that point. A lot of the purpose of him in the story is his exposing the truth at what happened at Janjira. So once that's been done, once the Muto is out, and once the destruction stuff is beginning, and the government conspiracy stuff is kind of ended, he kind of becomes a little bit superfluous in regards to the overall story. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there are a million things you could have done with him that would have made him even more interesting than he already is, and also continued him throughout the entire movie, one of them being making him the protagonist of the thing, which would have been pretty fucking cool. But regardless of that, I don't think his death was necessary. And the other thing is that, as emotional as it is, and as great as that final scene is, where he's up in the helicopter with Ford, and he imparts those dying words onto his son of "keep your family safe, whatever it takes," his death still feels a little bit off to me and a little bit forced, and almost just like the movie is kind of just like, oh, you like this character? You like this character? Bah! Killing him. Kind of like Game of Thrones in that way. So that also is very, very is a little bit frustrating. And I wish that his death could have either been a little bit more subtly done in regards to why he was killed off, and also in regards to how he's killed off. His death is just a little bit too... His death isn't enough given the character that he has in the movie. He just kind of falls off a bridge, and that's kind of sad. I do like that the male Muto is the thing that kills him. That kind of gives him that connection to his wife, but it is a little bit off. The other thing is that he kind of dies without getting any closure for his character, and without being given enough time to have a true emotional response to the monsters. As soon as he finds out that this whole situation was caused by the existence of giant monsters, he just dies, and we never get to learn how he feels about that, and how exactly he perceives this whole situation. How angry is he at Monarch for covering the whole goddamn thing up, and also, how does he feel about the existence of giant monsters? They kill him before any of that is even brought to the forefront. Now, this will also bring me into another problem that I have with his character, though it's more of a plot problem than it is necessarily a problem with his character, but it is certainly an issue. So, throughout the entire beginning of the movie, Ford is calling his dad crazy, and every character we interact with prior to meeting Joe perceives him as being crazy and kind of kooky at and kind of crazy conspiracy theorist for what happened to his wife and what exactly is going on at Janjira. And Ford also mentions that this is another one of his crazy kookpot theories, which is why he got arrested in Janjira. Now, the problem is that we never truly get a definitive theory by Joe Brody as to what exactly he thinks happened at Janjira. He thinks it was a military mistake, thinking it was a design flaw they were covering up, but we never get the details of what exactly are these crackpot theories that he's suggesting. I guess the whole reason why Ford thinks he's crazy is because he thinks that something not on the level happened aside from the earthquake causing the nuclear meltdown, but we don't get enough of what exactly are these crackpot theories that he's posing. Mainly, we never truly get an answer for how much he knows about Monarch and how much he knows about the cover-up, and does the dude theorize that giant monsters are involved in what's going on? And the biggest scene that makes it confusing as to how much Joe Brody knows is that very now kind of iconic monologue he gives to Dr. Serizawa and the Monarch people interrogating him, which was the kind of promo audio for the official main trailer and kind of the crux of the main trailer. The whole thing about you have no idea what's coming, it's going to send us back to the Stone Age, this was not an earthquake, it wasn't a typhoon, all that good stuff. It was an amazing way to advertise the movie. In the movie, it's a little strange, because the trailer for the movie seemed to imply that he was talking about Godzilla. That you have no idea what's coming was referring to Godzilla waking up. It's going to send us back to the Stone Age, referring to the destruction Godzilla was going to cause. That's not what's going on at all, or at least I don't think so. What he seems to be talking about, given the context of what's going on in the scene, is that Joe is talking about the EMP that's being caused by the cocoon that the Muto is encased in, and it feeding on the radiation. That's what caused everything back in 1999. That this is all building to another massive EMP, and that this is all building to the creature waking up. Now, it doesn't really lessen the coolness factor of that monologue, although it still would have been cooler if it was about Godzilla, but that monologue is still great, and it does, for the most part, make sense in regard to the EMP. But it still feels odd because we're just not sure how much he knows about what's going on, about Monarch, and about what exactly is going on, and about what's going on with the whole cover-up situation. And my other big question is, does he know about Godzilla? Not necessarily does he know that Godzilla exists, but does he theorize that a similar cover-up happened in 1954 that happened in 1999? Now, it would seemingly be yes, because there's a newspaper article on his wall about the supposed cover-up of the Bikini Atoll test in 1954. Now again, it lends the question of, does he think there's something going on with monsters? Is he reading any reports about a giant monster appearing in 1954, and about what happened in the Philippines? Again, we just don't learn enough about what he thinks is going on, and how much he knows about the monsters and about the whole situation. And again, I wish that he wouldn't have died before he would have gotten an opportunity to both react to the monsters, and also he wouldn't have died before he could have gotten a proper dialogue scene with Dr. Serizawa. Because they really would have had the most interesting dynamic in the film. Because Serizawa is the main one covering up everything going on with the Muto, and Joe is the one trying to remove the curtain from this cover-up, and also what they're covering up is the thing that killed his wife. I want to know how he feels about Serizawa. Does he hate him? Does he respect him? How would he feel for Serizawa?